Well, welcome to what might be the most boring of all our videos ever, but one of the most muscular, potent, and robust videos ever, because in social work and social justice activism, there's at least two aspects of this that you need to be reflecting on. When we think of federal, provincial, municipal funding, all of us were supposed to know this from our grade 8 civics class or grade 6 or whatever it was that was supposed to have happened to us. But I think sometimes people forget how federal, provincial, municipal responsibilities play out in our nation. So maybe you learned it but you've forgotten, or maybe you weren't really listening when it happened because you thought, why do I need to know this? Who cares? And now you're realizing, hey, I do need to know this. This is really important. And or now that you're in third year social work, fourth year social work, you may be thinking, well, this isn't my responsibility to figure this stuff out. It is the responsibility of my coordinator or my executive director or the board in the agency that I work in. Well, here I am today to tell you that as a social worker, social justice activist, on all kinds of levels, in all kinds of ways, you really need to understand federal, provincial, municipal funding. And even when you think you've understood it all and figured it all out, go back and read it all again, because it may have changed in the interval, or there may be changes and edits happening in the future, and you want to be ahead of the curve, because as a social worker, social justice activist, you want to kind of be a leader too, not always just sort of passively accepting. You want to be challenging. So I'm going to just, from this little list that I printed off from the computer, I'm going to just review some of the basic structure parts here. So the federal government is responsible for what? I'm going to tell you. Good question. They are responsible for agriculture, heritage and citizenship, immigration, environmental issues, fisheries and oceans, foreign affairs and international issues, trade, health, human resources and skills development, industry, intergovernment affairs, Aboriginal issues and northern development, emergency and disaster services, justice, labor, national defense, public safety, public works and government services, transport, infrastructure and communities, treasury board, veteran affairs, and western economic diversification. So that's federal government. And as I was reading that list, I know that you were probably saying to yourself, well, that sounds kind of fuzzy. I thought that item or that other item was connected to the provincial government. And you are wise in that. Exactly. Some of these categories are very, very mushy and messy, and they overlap. And the way they may have played out 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, may be different than today. So it's where the power is. If you understand how money works in your agency or for your issues, that's important. That's where influence often is, right? If you have no money to do stuff, you can't do stuff. You got to have at least a little bit of funding, right? Yeah. So understanding who to beg or harass is important. So we just went through some of the list of federal. I'm going to go through a quick list of the provincial. Provincial. Underneath provincial, it also states on this list Aboriginal relations, agriculture, rural development, energy, enterprise and advanced education, environment and sustainability, resource development, health. Now remember, health was also listed under federal government. We're going to come back to that. Infrastructure, international and intergovernmental relations, Justice and Solicitor General, Municipal Affairs, Service, Transportation, Treasury Board, and Finance. So see, again, there's some overlap there. And there's many lists. You can Google this and find it yourself and keep that list somewhere in your file. Now, municipal issues. Ambulance services, animal control, business licenses, bylaw enforcement, cemeteries, community and convention centers, cultural facilities such as museums and libraries, fire services, municipal land use planning, parks, public lighting, public transportation. Now, we've just realized transportation was in all three categories, wasn't it? It was listed in all three categories. Think about that. We're going to come back to that. Recreational facilities and programs, roads, streets and walkways, sanitary sewage, drainage, tourism, water supply and distribution. Now, I'm going to try and take a couple of issues that social workers might care about, and I'll walk them through how it gets very messy. Last night, I thought I was going to watch something cheerful, because sometimes life isn't very cheerful from where I live life. I thought, I don't watch something cheerful. So I happened to find this documentary on children. I thought, oh, it's going to be about children and hope and bouncy games and coloring. Well, it turned out to be more of that dystopian future that I always seem to be finding out more about. So here's what they were talking about in this documentary. 1/3 of children on planet Earth today, according to this documentary, have lead in their blood, lead in their brains. For those of you who haven't reflected before on what does lead do to a child when it's in your brain or in your blood, it has the potential to do neurological damage. Lead, depending on how much is in you, can give you learning disabilities. Some people suggest it can prepare you to have Alzheimer's later in life. There's a lot of damage that lead can do. Lead, how does lead get into children's bodies? Water pollution, air pollution, maybe lead paint. If you live in an old building, the paint may have lead in it. If you live near a factory where they used to have lead in their chemicals that they were mixing for whatever reasons, your kids might be exposed to that. So just take that one issue. As a social worker, if you are finding out that the kids in your area have a disproportionate statistical profile for learning disabilities, maybe you're living in Flint, Michigan. And there's a whole documentary, many documentaries now being made about places like Flint, Michigan. So in Flint, Michigan, the municipality, the equivalent of a municipality, decided to do a different kind of water plant, water control system. And in doing that, and there were lots of complicated aspects, but I'm just giving you the brief version because I want to give you an example of how municipal, provincial, federal can overlap. So, when the municipality did this change in how they did their water plant, it had the consequence of a high level of lead going into the water for everybody in the community. The poorer neighborhoods, because they had old pipes, had a higher ratio of this lead going into their water. At first, for a few years, if my memory is correct, the municipality denied that there was lead going into the water. Different researchers doing pro bono work came to prove there was high levels of lead and it was causing permanent learning disabilities in some of the kids. That's a municipal issue. Water. It becomes a provincial issue because health and education are provincial responsibilities. If you had a community where all of a sudden, let's say, half the kids have severe learning disabilities, the provincial government is responsible for paying for all the extra needs teachers, all the extra classes, all the kinds of supports that might be required for those kids as they go through the school system. That's a provincial responsibility. On the level of doing research to examine how does lead get into the water and what are the consequences, that's usually a federal responsibility. I would suggest it's also a crime. I think it's a crime. It is a legally to my mind. If you own a company or you are in charge of the water plant and you knowingly set up a situation where there's a risk of brain damage to 5,000 kids, to my mind, that's an assault. That's criminal neglect. You've done a crime. And the federal government is responsible for setting laws around crime, around some kinds of crime. I would like to see that all of these people who do things like this across our whole nation, that there are consistent laws. If you don't have consistent laws around where to open a factory and what kind of pollution you can dump into the water or into the community, factories will just say, oh, we're all going to move to that province where we can dump our shit in the water because it's only a provincial legislation, versus saying all of us in our entire nation equally deserve the right to clean water that won't damage our kids. Call me crazy, call me outrageous, call me a dangerous feminist.
Wild ideas.
Wild ideas, what can I say? So I just wanted to walk you through one really simple example. If you ever get a chance to learn about Flint, Michigan and bad water, and reflect on the water, when you turn on your tap at home, that's a municipal responsibility, and you pay municipal taxes around that to have access to that water. Then you have provincial government, you pay provincial taxes for the provincial government to help you and all of us in every province with issues around health, protecting our health, and around education, giving every kid, every person, the best opportunities to develop their brain in the best way. And then the federal government is responsible for, let's say, crime, and we could say that could be, it is a crime. If I made a decision, reflect on it this way, if I made a decision to punch 5,000 kids in the head so bad that they had brain damage, how fast would I be in jail?
Rather knowingly had a company that just regularly punched kids and you just let it happen.
Right, that's what I'm making the point about, right? It's not just some obscure thing. It should be against the law, but a lot of companies get away with doing these things. So now I'm going to take that issue, which we at first would say a municipal issue. I turn on the water at home, it's a municipal issue. What if you're an indigenous community and you turn on the water at home and you get toxic water, you get poison water, you get polluted water that gives you rashes, that gives you brain damage, you have mercury in your water at home, but you live on a reserve. The federal government is responsible for all the issues around indigenous communities around water. So when you hear of 65 indigenous communities in Canada or 165 indigenous communities in Canada who don't have clean water, that's a federal responsibility because they have, I think it's called a fiduciary responsibility to care for indigenous communities. So there you go. You see, now as a social worker, you have to reflect on that. If your families have only dirty water or bad water or health issues or learning disabilities and you're a social worker in that community, you have to reflect on who is causing this problem, but who can also help pay to change this situation, the solution, right? So municipal, provincial, federal, I'm just giving you one really solid, simple example there of water and families and social work. And it's not enough as a social worker to say, nah, water is not my responsibility. I'm a social worker. If you are in a community, there's a community, I'm trying to think of their name, Grassy Narrows, I think is their name, and for something like 35 years, everyone in the community has been exposed to mercury because there's a factory upstream that's been dumping crap in the water, and although the federal government has paid for studies and research, not much has changed for that community of Grassy Narrows. There's still mercury in their water. The fish they eat have mercury. The kids disproportionately are having really severe learning disabilities. Mercury also can give you cancer, from my understanding. This is a federal responsibility, but the federal government hasn't done anything to change the situation. And it's still going on. So if you were a social worker there, I don't think you're stepping up to the plate responsibly to say, water, mercury, not my issue. I'm a social worker. I just sit there with kids and families and say, so how do you feel about having Alzheimer's? How do you feel about having cancer? How do you feel about all the kids in this community maybe having learning disabilities? Oh, it's just the mercury in the water, and I'm just a social worker, and I'm just going to talk to you about your feelings. No, I would hope that we would step up and try and do some social justice advocacy to change the situation. Right? So to do the change, you need to understand federal, provincial, municipal boundaries, responsibilities, and so on.
Would that be, sorry, would that be different for people, like there's like the city water, where like you pay those taxes, but it's like it's from the city that gives it to you, versus like people that are on like wells, for example, like does that operate the same way, or would that be different?
Well, it's different. One, you've kind of hinted at, yeah, see how at first you go obvious, simple, but then it gets way more complicated. So, rural and isolated communities, people usually, whether it's settler folk, they have to dig their own wells on their own property, and then they have their own water. That's their own problem. But if you live on a reserve, because the federal government has promised to take care of issues like water, it's the federal government's responsibility to provide you with good wells, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, if you live in the city, so for example, I live here and I think I pay, let's say, $200 a year for the privilege of accessing water, and then I pay a certain, let's say, another $200 for the water that I send away, like the dirty water. So and that's a municipal tax I pay, and in exchange for that, I get to drink water and flush the toilet.
Yep.
Okay, that's a municipal thing, and every municipality in Canada sets the rules around that, how much the water will cost, and where the boundaries of the municipality are for where they could pay those taxes. If you live outside of the municipality, rural and remote, you do your own well, and if your water is crappy, it's kind of your own problem. Dig your well different, right? So, yeah, you see, very different, very different. Good question there, good question. And sometimes ordinary folk don't even really understand how does this all play out, right? They don't get it, right? And then this can also set up situations of racism. So let's say somebody lives in a rural or remote community and they say, hey, I had to dig my own well and produce my own water. Those 65 indigenous communities that don't have clean water, why doesn't everybody just dig their own well and sort that out themselves? Well, one, the federal government promised when they took land and set treaties with indigenous people that they would do this. This is their promise. That's what the treaties are, right? Also, on reserves, sometimes it's different than, let's say, Carlene and I fall in love and we decide we're going to go live in a log cabin in the bush somewhere, and we both have jobs and we both have credit cards and all this stuff. So we go to the bank and we say, hey bank, we want to borrow $100,000 because we're going to build a log cabin and we're going to dig a well. And the bank goes, okay, we're going to charge you this much interest and blah, blah, blah. And if you don't pay your bill, we're going to repossess your log cabin. And we will haunt you for the rest of your life. To Carlene and I, right? We sign that. It's a legal document. And anywhere in Canada, they can hunt us down and make us pay our bills, and they can repossess that. Here's where things are different. If Carlene and I were Indigenous and we lived on a reserve, and we went to a bank and said, we want to borrow $100,000 because we want to dig a hole and make a well, and we want to make a log cabin. We can't do this. The bank won't lend us money because the bank cannot repossess that house on a reserve. So Carlene and I are like, we're two good people, we work, we have a happy life, we want to be good citizens, but we can't get the capital to go and borrow to build our house and to dig our well, right? So unless we have friends and relatives who'll lend us $100,000, how are we going to build a house?
So you already start off disadvantaged.
You're disadvantaged. So this is part of the problem that people have who want to, let's say there's 100 families on some reserve and they want to make 100 wells so that each house has its own well, the way you might have in a rural community here, right? Well, not all of those 100 families can go borrow the money because the land cannot be repossessed. It's owned collectively by the indigenous community. You can't sell it, you can't loan against it. So you see, right? So the settler person who lives rural and says, well, just build your own well, they don't always understand the dynamics that play out.
Yeah, either they just logistically haven't thought it through.
Right, they haven't thought it through, or they don't know. They just don't even know. They're ignorant about how this stuff works because they've never lived on a reserve.
They don't know the struggles that go along with that.
Exactly. So, again, our role as social workers would be to help everybody understand, federal, provincial, municipal. These are some of the dynamics that are in play. This is not an interpersonal failing of, just go build your own well. It's more complicated than that. I'm not even sure if people on a reserve, like if Carlene and I were status Indigenous folk, and we said, we've decided we want to, let's say through some miracle, we won $1 million, and we said, we're going to go build a house and dig a bunch of wells. I think we would have to have permission from the band council to do it, and then we also would still not own those wells or that log cabin, right? I think the band council could say, we will let you live in your log cabin for 99 years or something, Carlene inside, but we still will own the land
and the
house itself. So I'm not exactly sure how that plays out, but I know that this is one of the complications for people who live on reserves and who are Indigenous, that the federal government is responsible for doing this stuff, and that's part of why banks and so on won't touch you, because it's a different story, let's say, right? And the rules of the game are different too in terms of how capitalism works. A ghost! A ghost! So, that was one thing I wanted to play out for the viewer to reflect on. What are the roles of social workers and why do we need to understand all this stuff? Okay. Now I'm going to take another example. Let's say transportation. At first you go, transportation. Well, that's an individual responsibility. Tuba's supposed to buy her own car. Carlene's supposed to buy her own car. Sai should buy her own car. If y'all each want a truck, go buy a truck. You want a train, go buy a train.
I'll just purchase a bus, because that's responsible.
Just do that individually. But then again, no. Right? The capitalism says go buy your individual stuff. Okay. But what about, let's say, as a federal government and as a provincial government, we want to lower the pollution rates in Canada. So the federal government and the provincial government may say, hey, we want to improve the bus system in Prince George because we want 1,000 people to park their cars and lower the pollution rates and get everybody taking the bus. Also, we want all the students at the university and the college to be able to take the bus. We want all kinds of workers to have better lives. There's a lot of reasons why you want to have a good public transportation system. So it's not just an individual responsibility about transportation, it's also a provincial and federal, right? So, okay, you go, yeah, okay, that works. So that now think of the Highway of Tears, and we did a video on that. We talked about, okay, who's supposed to now pay for that? So let's just chunk that out a little bit. Like take out your Lego blocks, and we're going to make little piles of Lego blocks. On the one hand, the federal government is responsible for Indigenous issues. They're supposed to pay to make Indigenous people's lives safe, good, and equal to all the other citizens in Canada. Well, the Highway of Tears is suggesting to us that a lot of Indigenous women and a lot of rural poor women hitchhike because they have no car. The way Tuba, Carlene, and Sai were all supposed to go buy their own car because they can go to the bank, take out a loan, and do that. Right? So, if you live on an indigenous piece of land, you can't necessarily go to the bank and put one asset against another. Right? Like I could put, let's say, my little house here to take out a car loan, or when you're a student you take out a car loan and you build up your credit, and there's a lot of reasons why indigenous folks might not have access to the same credit. Also, it's in a way not their responsibility. We take for granted that in most communities you have a bus. Even if sometimes it's a crappy bus or it's poorly scheduled, or, you still have something. But in many indigenous communities you don't have any transportation. So, federal responsibility for indigenous, but transportation is usually thought of as a municipal issue or an individual issue. Go buy your own car if you want one. Right? So now, then you say, well, how is this a social work issue? Why should social workers give a crap about transportation? Oh, if you're working with poor single moms need to live often in the cheapest area of town, which is often the outskirts. They need to drop their kids off at daycare or at school. That's a social worker issue. Single moms often need to work to get some money to pay their rent. So the single mom, she's sitting somewhere thinking, I need to have a really good bus system to get my kid to school in the morning at 8, and then my other kid to this other school or to daycare or something for 8:15, so that I can take the bus and be at work for 5 to 9, so that I can work 9 to 4, pick up my kid at 4:15, my other kid at 4:30, and get back home safely. That's a social work issue. That's a very practical issue. But if a mom can't do that with her kids, then she can't work, then she can't have as much money and freedom and opportunities in life, then she might be living in a dump on the outskirts of town and get depressed and maybe turn to drinking, right? Like one thing leads to another in life for humans, right? So transportation, a municipal issue, but also a provincial issue and a federal issue, but also an individual issue. It's one of those zones where who's going to help and how do you figure it out? A lot of people don't realize that the bus system here in Prince George, you get on the bus and you pay $2 to get on the bus. Or as students, you pay $50 a month for a bus pass, right? Or I'm almost a senior and I'll be paying $50 for a monthly pass or something, right? All those decisions about seniors, students, so on, that ends up being a collective accomplishment between you and BC, because I think you now pay your monthly bus pass through part of your tuition.
Yep.
So that's, let's say, the private sector, although it's a publicly funded organization, but students voted on that, right? So students get a bus pass, they get on the bus. That's also been subsidized by the provincial government because they want to get the pollution down, they want cities to function happily, right? So again, at first you think, well, why should I care about who funds buses? Well, as a social worker, you may need to care because either you're going to have words like the highway tears, if there's nothing, or you will have single moms, disabled people, elderly people, poor people, people who are intellectually challenged, who can't get to their doctor's appointments. If there's no bus service or the bus service is crappy, it has consequence for pretty much all of our clients. So you need to think about it. So here's another example. So I've given you the example, federal, provincial, municipal, about clean water. I've given you an example about baseline transportation. And now I'm going to give you another example that's very, very current, C19. Right? So on the one hand, C19, it's just a nasty virus in the air. It's like you catch a cold, life sucks. It's a thing that humans deal with. Some of us are going to die, some of us won't. What's that got to do with social work? Not my problem. Yeah, it's your problem. Here's why. For example, The federal government we've been watching them almost by the hour. The federal government is looking at our whole nation is on lockdown. And that's federal government. The federal government is responsible for things that happen at the whole nation. Federal government is also responsible for our borders. Who's getting in right now and how are they getting in? And for example, in America, there's areas of America where there's high rates of C-19, and Canada is saying, we don't want you folks coming in right now. Our borders are also, they're testing people to see their temperature and forcing them to wear masks on the planes and so on. That's a federal responsibility. And yay, federal government, go for it. Because otherwise, Haida Gwaii, which is an indigenous community here in northern BC, a lot of tourists, let's say, from America, I'm kind of making this up to kind of teach about what I'm wishing you to get. So if the federal government did not do a good job of that, you could have 10 tourists one day come from America, go to Haida Gwaii, infect the whole community, and cause maybe 200-300 elders to die from C-19. And then if you're a social worker in that region, you've got an incredible issue right now of grief, healthcare, crisis, care, like helping all the survivors from each of those families. You've got a 5 or 10 year problem now, helping all those families heal from what they've lost. So the federal government not doing national boundaries, right?
Yeah,
becomes an in your face, literally in your face issue as a social worker, let's say at Haida Gwaii, right? So we've had a lot of these situations where indigenous communities have actually set up roadblocks in their communities and saying, we want no outsiders here because we have 0 right now, C-19. So we want to protect our reserve or our community from any outsiders coming in. Right? So that's kind of like, in a way, a municipal issue.
Mm-hmm. That's being made individual.
Right. So, but it's every time something changes in our lives as social workers, your career from, let's say, 25 when you graduate to 65 or 75 when you retire, all of these different dynamics are playing out. Federal, provincial, municipal, private responsibility, family responsibility, community responsibility. Things are always kind of morphing, and I can't even predict what you might have come to your lives as social workers 10, 20, 30 years from now. But I can predict that knowing this pattern of federal, provincial, municipal, and it's your foot, I thought it was the cat. Bree does that. She bangs her head on my foot, so I bang back. Sorry, it's your foot.
I also thought it was.
Who's the boss in this household? The cat. So, reflecting on all of these things. So here's another, like, very concrete one that C-19 has caused. These two beautiful activist scholars right here in my as I say, in my family right now, in my home right now, kind of like a little bit like family. This summer, if you had not been able to access, and we at the Women's Center had not been able to access this federal government money for students to help you get through the summer so that you'll have some money in September, would have been a disappointment for all involved. Yeah. Right? So municipally, right now, a lot of municipalities are trying to get the federal government to step up and give all kinds of money to students so that when September comes, you're all going to be okay. Partially because the municipalities in the past have been able to hire students to do a lot of park work or with kids or canoe clubs or
they have a lot of temp jobs or like casual positions.
Casual positions, and that's been the way it's been for decades and decades, is that municipal governments have been counted on to help the students in their communities make a little bit of money, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 during the summer to pay your tuition and then your living expenses. Well, right now, lots of municipalities are completely shut down. Their pools are shut down. Everything is shut down. So they can't give those opportunities to students, right? So they've looked up to the provincial government and the federal government and say, what can you offer? And so there's been this, but then also the federal government has, I think they're called SERBs, or I don't even know the name. There's initials and acronyms, but the federal government has says we're going to try and create all kinds of programs for youth to prepare for the school year. And then they've also, the federal government has stepped up to try and give money to nonprofit organizations. So that's a municipal grassroots level again, to provide help them set up new situations for September. So new ways of washing, new ways of distancing, new ways of managing the illnesses, and to help figure it out so that when everybody goes back in September, or if they go back in September, it'll be better. But also doing stuff like this on the web. There's been federal funding to nonprofits to help them do some of this kind of stuff to A, help the students get some money, but B, help the agencies to continue into the future, right? Mm-hmm. So federal, provincial, municipal, sometimes the way these situations will work too, and again the pattern, right, is a program might get initiated from the federal government, and the federal government will say, if your organization can get $5,000 from the provincial government, we'll match it with $10,000. And then the provincial government will say, well, if your municipality kicks in $1,000, we'll match and we'll match. And then they'll also often say, well, first you've got to get some buy-in from your local community. So first you have to raise $1,000 worth of donations, right? So as a social worker, knowing how those patterns work and those games work, and always having something going on in your community, like your yearly fundraiser walk for cancer, or your yearly Christmas marathon thing, or where you raise that little bit of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, at first you might go, oh my God, this is a lot of work for $3,000. Who needs $3,000? Well, hey, you do, because if you don't get that $3,000, maybe you don't get that $5,000, and then you don't get the 10, and you don't get the 20 that matches the other, right? That's the way these games often work. So knowing how to raise funds for your cause, whether it's the Kidney Society, the Cancer Society, Alzheimer's Society, the Pride Group, the Women's Shelter, almost all of these organizations have some initiatives, or should have some initiatives, around fundraising. And it can be a hassle to sell raffle tickets or bake sale or whatever. Like, oh God, I went to school for 5 years not to do bake sales. I know we're often very resistant, but those things will prove to the other levels of government that you have buy-in from your grassroots community. If you don't, sometimes they'll say, well, if your people cared about you, they would show up for your yearly
whatever it
Christmas party or whatever. Or they'd make donations. Since nobody in your community is prepared to even throw $5 at this issue, neither are we. Sucks to be you. Right? So there's more I could say about that, but I just want you to always be reflecting upon how the three levels of government link with private donations and community, and how you as a social worker need to have some wisdom around how this all plays out. Sometimes you can shame them. You can say, hey, provincial government, given that you're responsible for this and this and this and this, and given that the municipal government has stepped up with this amount of money, why aren't you doing this? Huh? Provincial government? And also, whenever there's an election coming up, that's a great time to go and shame these different levels of government, and then you can get them to say on the record that they care about this issue. Don't you care about the Highway of Tears? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, you do, eh? Okay, are you going to do this and this? Because during election time, everybody wants to promise, and they want you to love them, and they want you to vote for them. So as a social worker and an advocate about your issues, that's a time to go to those candidates meetings, or to send in something where you get them like a letter to the editor, and then you force them to say something back to the letter to the editor, and then you go and you apply for $5,000, and you say, you said right here, right? and you got them. You got them, right? You got them under your thumb for a minute. So all this kind of stuff, that's how we become leaders in social work, rather than just followers, rather than just 9 to 5 show up, 9 to 5 show up. But when you have a vision of how does this all play out and how could it play out differently, right? So let's say mercury poisoning in the water, in grassy narrows, in indigenous community, if you're a social worker there, reflect on when's the next election and how can you keep that issue in the local paper and how can you get different strategies going to make it different. Sometimes it's not going to be a story where you make it different overnight. It might be a 10 or 20 or 30 year story, but it's still a story that we in social work belong at the front of, to be kind of snarling and barking and making discomfort for the levels of government who are supposed to be there to care for all the citizens under their protective realm, right? So the municipality, whatever the realm of their power or authority or legitimacy is, make them step up and be honorable and do the right thing. And it's up to us to make them do that sometimes as social workers and social justice activists. There's 50 other stories I could talk my way through, federal, provincial, municipal, but the culture, for example, municipalities are responsible for culture, but so is the provincial government's responsible for education. Education and culture often go right together. And then indigenous issues is culture, right? So there's another quick example of the 3 levels of government connecting. So, thank you for listening to what could be one of the most boring conversations ever, federal, provincial, municipal funding. I know it's not exciting, but it has the potential to become exciting. I'll tell you, the first time I applied for a grant and got it, in a women's organization that I was involved in, and we got the grant, I was just over the moon. I felt like a friggin' pirate. I felt like I had unlimited power. All of us at $10,000, and we could put that on wages for a woman for doing some work at our women's organization. Wah! And now every year when we get the money for the women's center, every year for, let's say, 20 years, we get 1, 2, or 3 summer students. So let's say 40 women like you over the years have had a chance to make a little bit of money, learn some new skills, get their name out there in the community, help the women's center, help old ladies who don't understand technology, do good cause, good issue, Highway of Tears. Like, there's a lot of amazing stuff that we get to do because we apply for that grant every summer. It's fabulous. One last thing, when you apply for grants and you get into this money stuff, the time zone is its own universe. It really is. So just to use that example, we have to usually start dreaming, what are we going to do with our summer students? We start dreaming our project and our plan in January. We have to have the documents submitted, I believe, in February. We don't find out if we got the money until May this year.
Yeah, we didn't find out until May.
Till end of May.
End of May, yeah. And then we have to have the money spent by the end of August, right? So sometimes these things are a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan. It's not the kind of thing where you get an idea, you put an application in when you get around to it. There's often very strict kind of sequencing of how things go, and it's often way ahead of when the money's actually in your hand. So reflect on that too. You might have, the municipality has only a 2-week time where you can apply for this particular thing, but you might not find out till 4 months later if you got it. Meanwhile, you've applied for this other thing, and that's a 6 month turnaround. And then with all of these things, you usually have to do a final report. So reflect on that too. So we have to spend the money by the end of August, and for you too, and then we maybe have to get our final report in, let's say, by the end of September. And there's 20 things they might ask us, and there has to be proof and evidence that y'all had a good learning experience, right? So there's a lot at play, a lot of administrative stuff too to make it happen, a lot of follow-up and sequencing. So there's my final thoughts on that for the moment. Thank you for this time from Carlene and Tuba, and this is Federal, Provincial, Municipal Funding Relationships.